Okay. Let's get this show on the road. Hello, happy Wednesday, everybody. How are we doing today? So, I just put a poll in the chat to get a feel of how many people have watched The Legend of Vox Machina, and it seems like most of you have not. Shame. Shame on you. Shame on you is all I can say. Well, unfortunately, like all of my other streams, there's definitely going to be some spoilers in here, so look out. But if you haven't yet, I highly recommend that you have. And I was a little curious about what the ratio was going to be because, as someone who is a big fan of Critical Role, is a big fan of Dungeons and Dragons in general, and, is in Facebook groups and Discord channels where people are very, very into D&D. It was very much just like in in the zeitgeist. People were into it. People were watching it, but for the general public, I wasn't sure how many people were going to be super familiar with it. And, in your Amazon Prime algorithm, if it's going to be showing up on your splash page. But yeah, if you haven't yet, I guess I can give everyone a quick little background into why Critical Role's Legend of Vox Machina is so incredible. So, Critical Role is a live streaming Dungeons and Dragons show. They stream weekly on Twitch. They've been doing it. It started out as a home game, and they've been doing it now since like 2015. This show is based off of their first campaign. They are now well into their main campaign number 3. And yeah, they are, a big part of what a lot of Dungeons and Dragons podcasts and shows are based on today. They have a huge role in giving D&D its late resurgence and making it more popular in the more recent years. So yeah, they are that bitch when it comes to D&D. And they are their story is really, 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 really fucking incredible. So it's like 8 voice actor friends that all came together and made this show. And so when they first launched a Kickstarter for this show, and I think the goal was like $750,000. They raised that in like under an hour, and then in the first 24 hours, like 32,500 people had already contributed, and in 24 hours they hit like $4.3 million, some crazy number. And then at the end of it, I think up to like 88,000 people contributed, and they raised like $11.3 million, all from like crowdfunding, kickstarting campaign. It was wild. So it's like a story that you can't help, even if you don't know anything about it, like root for and fall in love with. And the whole, I think the whole aspect, the whole like crowd-funded, fan-funded aspect of The Legend of Vox Machina is just another interesting example of what I think is the future of marketing and brand loyalty, and a lot of influencer-created products. Like you see this, I've talked about this before with the whole like Jeffree Star, Shane Dawson makeup palette, and how that took showing something from the ground up being built and feeling like the fans were part of the creation process that made you feel like the product was yours as well, and created this, unheard of brand allegiance. And then you see it with, bigger celebrities with the, Kim Kardashian Skims and like Rihanna's Fenty Beauty. Like when there is a trust in the creator, then it'll take the product to a next level. That being said, like, it still has to be good. But with this grassroots style of audience buy-in, it definitely gives it a leg up. And I'm not gonna lie, it's really hard for me to give this an unbiased, objective review because of this grassroots style audience buy-in. And that doesn't last forever, obviously. If you have everyone involved in your dream, and then you produce a shitty project, then that might sustain you for the first launch. But if you don't give people something good, they'll walk away or lose interest. But yeah, it's Critical Role has done something really cool here, where it's like this story, when in the nature of Dungeons and Dragons, is like an improv style of storytelling. So like as a fan, as an audience member, you're watching this story grow. You're watching this show, these people get bigger and more successful, and you feel like you're a part of it. And then to watch it come into this animated show is just, it was such a cool experience. But yeah, I don't know. I guess what I'm trying to say is like with this audience buy-in, even if the show sucked, I still would have been like happy for them. I still would have been rooting for them. And I was just so excited to see it that it definitely, you know, gave it a little head start in terms of the content that it was creating. But yeah, so I'm going to try my best to give an objective and unbiased story review, but let me pull up my notes here. Okay, so I saw Justin Simone. You kind of mentioned similarities to Arcane. So one of the first things that I really did like about this show is that they released it in these 3-episode mini arcs, which I think is a really, again, there's so many things that feel just like the future of content consumption. I think it's a really good mixture of like the anticipation of weekly TV releases with the, you know, inevitable nature of binge watching streaming culture. So I think it's like a good thing in the middle. So, and then it's like there's like mini stories within the larger story, and you get to binge it, but then you still have to wait for the next week. So I really like that they did that. Arcane did that as well, which I really, really loved. What else? But yeah, apart from like the general excitement I had, which was like knowing the basic story points already, because, you know, if you've watched the show, then you kind of know what's going to happen. But I do think they did a really great job of establishing the world and the plot. Like, I thought the pacing was very well done. And, you know, right off the bat, they establish a tone that's very fun. It's a little campy, but, you know, still very action heavy. And I think it actually, I feel like I've said actually a bunch of times, but because I can't think of, you know, something else that was based on like a D&D style mechanics, but I thought they did a really good job of establishing D&D mechanics in their world building. You know what I mean? So like, the nature of, you know, the D&D magic is there's so many options, there's so many things you can go. Everyone has different races and different classes that you can be, and you have different powers and different capabilities depending on that. And yeah, you know what I just thought of? If you watch this show and you do like it, they do these like hour-long Q&As at the end of each episode story arc, and you kind of get some good insight, and they do it with like the cast and the producers and directors and artists and creators of the show. And so you kind of get a good, like more inside baseball knowledge of the intention that went into it. And there was so much intention that went into it, and it really shows. But one of the things they talked about that I also felt was really cool as a viewer is how they differentiated those styles of magic and capabilities in a really practical way that, you know, also establishes the parameters and the rules of the universe. Because when it comes to world building, like it has to make sense. You know, if everyone's just throwing around different magic or different strength styles, you're kind of like, where's the line? Or like, what makes someone just, you know, Superman, and what, you know, you have to work to get something. And in D&D, of course, that's mitigated by, you know, your level, obviously the dice. So it's like your successes and failures can be based on literally just dice rolls, or it can be on your stats, and it can be, you know, what school of magic you decide to choose. And they did a really good job of showing that and showing how those all interact together. So just in general, like, it was a really good fantasy magic world show. And you can see this in the differences between the magic. If we're going to talk about magic, there's different magic styles, right? So there's 3 characters in the show that use magic. You have Pike, who's a little gnome cleric. You have Kalis, she's a druid elf. And then you have Scanlan, who's a gnome bard, who, you know, isn't as, who kind of just has a couple spells in his rotary, if that makes sense. And so Pike, who's a cleric, she gets her magic from her god, Sarenrae, the Everlight. And so a lot of the magic that she's using, which is more of like a healer, is more like radiant magic, pulling in from the heavens or what have you. And then, you have Keyleth, who is a more nature-based magic. She's a druid, so her magic is more I'm trying to think of the school. Is it abjuration? But you can just see in like that they talked about the way they differentiated, right? Like you have Pike, who like uses like holy energy to like heal someone, whereas like if Keyleth wanted to heal someone because healing isn't her, primary focus, then she uses like more like, herbs and chants and spices and pulling from that, where, Pike will call from her god. And then Scanlan, who is also a magic user, just has a few spells that are more for like buffing purposes, means to like add a little extra oomph. Bards very much like turn the tide of a party. So you're going to have a bard that's going to, inspire people in your group to make them stronger, or tip the odds in their favor, or tip the odds against the opponent that they're fighting. And they just talked about how they wanted to make that very clear, so it didn't, because like in D&D you can be pulling from a lot of the same spells, but they wanted to like make it clear that these were like different uses of it, right? And that there's limits to those uses. And I thought they did a really good job with that, and so that just again made it a really good fantasy show. What else? Yeah, and then just kind of like in that same thread, like, I thought they also did a really good job of, I feel like I'm going to say really did a really good job, but they did a really good job a lot. Another mechanic that kind of, tempers powers and things from getting out of hand is, magic users will have a limited amount of spell slots they can use a day. And so the way that they incorporated in that show that would make sense to like a general audience or public viewers, sometimes the magic doesn't work. Sometimes they're too weak. Sometimes they're too tired. And that's very much, indicative of a roll of the dice. But I think it played in action very well because, part of the fun of D&D is kind of this theater of the mind aspect of it, and to see it actually play out in real life, animated life, was really, really fun. Yeah, I just thought like, just to give credit to the people who like worked on this show, I think the writers and the directors and the producers they brought in to actually like take a D&D campaign and make it a show did a really good job of making it palatable to the general audience. So if you don't know anything about D&D and you go into watching this show, I think you'll still have a really good time. It'll be very easy for you to follow along, and it'll make sense fairly quickly. What? Oh, you know what? I wrote down another note. One of the things I like that they did that was cool too is for a character like Scanlan, right, who in a D&D campaign would have access to a lot of spells. They limited that so it wouldn't get too confusing, and he's just like throwing around a bunch of stuff, and then it kind of puts everyone on the same playing field, because it did with a show that has this many characters. I was actually very impressed at how efficiently they differentiated those characters from each other. And, when you're building a D&D party, you kind of want to have some balance to it, and people have different strengths and different weaknesses, and that balances out how a combat sequence lays out and how things happen. And I thought they did a really good job of that. Oh my God, really good job. Someone do a counter. But back to the actual story arc of it, or the story and the plot of it all, I think a lot of this can be contributed to just the strength of Matt Mercer as a DM and the cast as role players in general, because this show is based off literally the campaign that Matt Mercer wrote in his head, and he's like such an incredible DM that it's there's something called the Mercer effect. He's such a good of a DM that sometimes it kind of like warps how like hard and how complicated it can actually be, because he just does it so seamlessly, and he has like a million things turning in his head at once, and he built this incredibly massive world. And the cast themselves is very good at like yes-anding and embodying these characters and making decisions as these characters, as opposed to like them as the person would want to do. These characters all have these elaborate backstories, and they really try to like make decisions and play things out as if that person would, or in that certain situation with the information they have, even though like the player themselves at the table might know more than their character actually does. And so the Briarwood arc, I'm so happy that this is what they chose for this first season, because it was so awesome. It's such a, I don't know if this is a side tangent, but I think one of the strengths of this show, and just kind of like what makes a good show in general, is in this kind of tone and this kind of storytelling, is you don't want to get too bogged down by being too precious about the characters, if that makes sense. Because it's like you have 7 characters with all elaborate backstories that all have this story to tell, but the way that Matt does it, like in the game, is that he uses these like mini arcs within the big campaign to kind of like let one character shine, and it's like that's when their backstory and that's when their character fully develops, and they kind of get to like play around with like what makes them who they are. And they did that in this show as well, because if they came in right and it's just like they spent, because this is just the tip of the iceberg. These characters are amazing. There's so much more to tell, but it's like if you spend all this time telling all of these like elaborate backstories for all of these characters, like while that might be interesting, if you're coming in brand new and you don't know anything about them, it's kind of like, it can take away from the efficiency of the story. It can kind of get bogged down, and it feels like it's not really servicing the overall experience of it. It's just like wanting to be very precious and make sure that this character is given every possible moment that they had and that they deserve. But I liked that they, kept with the whole mini arc thing, and then they kind of just really focused on like Percy's storyline. And I still felt that like within this show, you still got glimpses into these characters to, figure out who they are in a general sense, their vibe, how they interact or react to different situations. But in terms of going deep, they kind of really focused on Percy and this whole Briarwood arc, which I thought was very fun and very cool. I was actually very pleased with how they balanced like the fun with the kind of intense violence and like the horror and the creepiness of it all, because the violence in this show is actually really fucking cool. And that's another great thing about animation, is like you can go super hard when it comes in terms of violence, because it's a little easier on the mind and brain to watch violence in an animated than to see it in real life. And so they went hard, and D&D is kind of brutal. You kill a lot of shit, so it makes sense it would be a super violent show. And it's like, no, this is a very adult show, a very, very brutal violence. And then because the Briarwoods, with the main villains being Delilus and Silas Briarwood, one of them is a necromancer, one of them is a vampire, there was just these really, really great horror elements that were very creatively animated. And watching these kind of like behind the scenes Q&As, you saw that there was a lot of intention in like differentiating the monsters, and just very aware of like the oversaturation of like, fantasy elements and stuff. Like even when they were animating the dragon, they were like, okay, everyone's seen a million dragons. How do we make our dragon unique? How do we make it fit this world? Because in D&D, dragons talk, and they're very smart, and they're very wise and all this stuff. And so they wanted to create a dragon that still had those capabilities to, talk and emote and that kind of stuff, but they also wanted it to have a very striking, unique look. And they talked about how they took a lot of different inspirations from like different animals. Like they showed different versions, that they had ones that had more of like a shark's head, more of like a feline head. It was really, really cool. And they're talking about the similar thing with the wraiths, because there's like these creepy like demon wraiths, but that the way like everything is like dripping, and there's like this kind of this like black oil that comes off of them, and when they touch other people, then like the oil starts oozing out of them. It was really, really cool and really creative, because you can only, you take a certain amount of damage in a D&D game, but like the way that they showed Silas and Delilah, or Delilah specifically, necromancy powers was really fucking dope. Which was another cool thing about this show. I mean, there's two things that's cool about this as like both a fan and an audience member. So as a fan, in any good like book to adaptation from like a TV show or a movie, if it's done well, then you do justice to the source material, but then you also get to see things that you didn't get to see in the book. Like, I think the best example of this is the Hunger Games movies. So in the Hunger Games books, it's all told from the perspective of Katniss. So it's like, while things are alluded to and things, you don't actually get to see them. And then in the movie, we got to see like the machinations of the Capitol and like what was going on in the other districts. And it added a lot to the story. And it was really cool to see that on screen. And then similarly for this show, Silas and Delilah Briarwood are, the villains or the NPCs. So while you still get to interact with them and you like know their backstory, you don't really get to see it unfold. So it was really cool as a fan to see, how Silas and Delilah came to be. But then also just as a generic audience member, they make for such good villains. It's just like, it's so dark and so sweet. It's like fucked up and like gross, but then it's like sweet and it's like romantic. And then like another version of this that was added into the show that I think ended up making it a very strong story too was the whole storyline with Pike, who's the gnome cleric. That whereas in the game, the Ashley Johnson is the one who plays Pike, and she is also on a TV show. I think it's called Blind Spotting. And so she had to be gone for a lot of the sessions. So they would just be like, oh, she's like at the temple doing this or the other. They would come up with some reason why she couldn't be there. But then in the show, they really took that opportunity to be like, okay, what would be going on with her? Where would she be? Like, what did that mean? Like, what did she get while she was away? And then I actually thought it really added to the whole world building aspect of the show, because like Pike's whole journey where she is kind of figuring her shit out with her god, with her, because she's a warrior of her faith, the Everlight or Saren Ray, having to figure that out and come to terms with that, I think actually did a really good job of explaining how gods interact in this world, because gods are a really big thing in D&D, which can seem a little like weird if you are not familiar with it. Like, it's just, you're like, oh, okay, so there's a bunch of super powerful gods and they're just talking to a bunch of people all the time and like getting involved in shit. Wouldn't that make things like super unbalanced and wonky? And so I thought it was really cool to see that like gods are very much like involved in that world, and how that would affect someone who is gaining their power from them, how they would, how that alignment works, and how you would reconcile that with what you're doing and the choices that you make. So, and just in general, just looked really cool. And I think Pike is so cute. But let me go back to my notes, see if I missed anything. Yeah. But anyways, speaking of Pike, we can kind of go... My microphone's being a little frank. Speaking of Pike, that just reminds me, because Pike is... I just love the character design of Pike. I think she is so stinking cute. I can't stand it. And I love the way Delilah looks. And the character design and the animation of this show is very impressive, because they did not have an unlimited budget. Like, they were definitely, not that they were, pinching pennies, but you can hear in the behind the scenes stuff, they talked about how they would make decisions based on like if something was too hard to animate or cost too much to animate, and they were very intentional about like what they chose to, spend a lot of money on, or put a little more, go a little bit harder, a little more with a fine tooth comb. And overall, I think it was super fucking creative. And I think the fact that they had they focus so much on making it creative and unique really shines through, because it makes it a more engaging and enjoyable experience, especially with things like combat sequences. Like, I think the action in this show for an animated show is actually really, really cool. I talked about earlier how, you know, in a D&D party, you have people with different strengths and capabilities, and that'll, you know, lend itself to different parts in a fight. And they like directed and composed that very, very well to show like how all these different fighting styles and contributions would lead to this very dynamic fight sequence. And I love that they didn't shine away from the action sequences. They were super cool, super fun. What else? Yep, I like that the fights also established stakes, consequences, you know, made it more of an adult kind of show. And again, I think I'm just going to bring it up again, the necromancy and the vamp. You know, actually, the way that they animated Silas as a vampire and his fighting style was actually really cool. I think they talked about making it more of like an animalistic, brutal kind of fighting style next to, you know, Delilah's more like conjuring of these demons. It was it made for a really, really cool balance. And, you know, back to kind of talking about the whole like theater of the mind aspect of it, right? It's like when you're describing these moments at a table, you're like, and then I come down and I like, pew, and you just have these epic moments in your head. And I felt that love for that experience in the show, specifically in this part where like Pike slams down on this battlefield with like her radiant energy, and it's, you know, something that happened in the game, and just like boom, this like beam of holy light, and just like lays way. It's so cool. This show has wonderful like epic moments while also really small cool moments. So just chef's kiss, so much fun. What? Oh yeah, and then another thing I liked about this in terms of story, hold on, is which I actually think the whole like improvisational D&D style of improv storytelling, improvisation. Oh god, you guys, improv storytelling. Okay, let's move on. Actually really lends itself to an engaging plot, I guess, when done well, and it was done very well in this instance, because, you know, that whole monster of the week style of storytelling is very fun to people who are used to like comics and sci-fi and stuff like that, and that's very much D&D. You're doing all these little like monster of the week moments, mini arcs within this larger campaign where there's like a greater goal, but all of these things you do kind of affect like how that bigger campaign is going to play out. And the show really captured that, because, you know, even just with this Briarwood arc, like this is, like I said, this is just the tip of the iceberg, guys. Like there was so much story to tell and so much more to go off of. And, you know, now that they've really hit it out of the park with this first season and you're in love with these characters, then you can kind of go back and go into the second seasons and do more of that like character storytelling and those little moments that are a little bit slower, but aren't as slow when you have like an allegiance to the characters that's set up with a really bomb first season, which I think this show did a really good job of. And then, yeah, I think that's basically all that I wanted to say. Yeah, if you guys haven't watched it yet, I highly, highly recommend it. I would actually love to hear what you guys think of it, because again, like I feel like this is a totally biased review of it, and I've only really seen one or like two of my friends who have never watched Critical Role watch the show, and they really enjoyed it. They really liked the characters, and it actually made them go and watch Critical Role because of, you know, the experience with the characters in the show. So from them, it was positive. But I am curious to see how like the general public feels about this show, because I do feel like I can't take off my rose-colored glasses, although I did try. But yeah. It's all I want to talk about today. I want to talk about goddamn Legend of Vox Machina. I'm just so happy it exists. I'm just such a big Critical Role fan. It's also, if you are into D&D, it's something that you can just pour endless hours into, because they have like 3 main campaigns and a bunch of littler campaigns, and all these sessions are like 4 hours long. So it's not for everybody. But if you really do love D&D, I mean, it's kind of like the gold standard. But yeah, I will open it up to some questions and comments and stuff in the chat, and then I will probably call it a day for today. Want a D&D shirt. It says Houses and Humans. Get it? Like Dungeons and Dragons. All right, so we do have some D&D nerds in here. David Jonius, D&D nerd of 30 years. Ooh, Justin Simone, you really liked it. Yes, so Abby K is the people that originally, so the people that make up the Critical Role cast are literally all voice actors. So they voice acted in the show, and it makes, and it's kind of like the perfect people for a public consumption role-playing game, because they'll really embody the character voice and all, acting and all, like mannerisms, and also they it's really, really good in terms of that. So highly recommend. But yes, they're all incredible voice actors, and they did such a good job on this show. Fantastic. Because I'm a big fan of voice acting. I just think as a craft in general, I think it's very interesting. I think it's an art that not a lot of people have reverence for. There's a voice acting documentary called I Know That Voice that I love so much, and it talks about like the musicality of voice acting, and it's very interesting if you guys are into that kind of stuff. So Warrior Mug says, I'm actually curious if Critical Role has more brand power than D&D itself at this point. I don't know if they have more brand power than D&D itself at this point, but they are, I think, a huge part of why D&D has gained more popularity in recent years, and brought it kind of like to the modern age. So they are a huge part of that. So definitely got a big share in that brand power and brand identity. How often do I get to play D&D? I play like once a week. Yeah. I wish I could play more. I've definitely, my mic is being loosey-goosey today. I've definitely almost joined like a few rando campaigns from just like strangers on the internet, but then had to stop myself and be like, Daryn, like, what do you do? Like, in what world? Like, do you have the time for this? Because it's like, each session will be like 3 or 4 hours long, so it's quite the commitment. I just started watching Critical Role with the Briarwood arc. That's actually Ryan Eddy is a really good way to get into it. So Critical Role in the beginning is it's a little hard to get into if you're just going to start with like episode 1, campaign 1, because they were definitely still figuring out like how to be a show, like they were all very good like D&D players, but it's different to just be playing at home and then playing for an audience. And so there are a lot of audio issues. There's not as much outward performance, it's like a lot more side conversation. It's like they're playing at home, but when the Briarwood arc starts is kind of where they start to iron some of those things out, and then it becomes a much more enjoyable experience. And then you can kind of go back, because the Craghammer arc isn't like as important, but you could like go back and watch it. There's actually this great video. I kind of want to shout her out, because I sent it to multiple people. Hold on one second. Let me pull it up. Yeah. So there is Ginny D. She makes this great video called How to Watch Critical Role. And it's just like, it's a really good starting point because there's just so much content. It can kind of feel like, getting into Star Trek for the first time. You're just like, where do I even begin? So it's a really good guide on kind of how to like get your feet wet and get started on it. And well, great, Abby Kays. I think that's a huge part of it. Like, while knowing all this stuff about Critical Role will definitely like influence your experience, I also think it's a part of the experience and what makes it so awesome. So glad to share the knowledge. Yeah. So with that, I think I'm going to wrap it up for the day. It's all good, Elgram. It was a quick one today, talking about Legend of Vox Machina. So I encourage you guys all to go watch Legend of Vox Machina. I will be back next week to... I guess I can kind of ask you, I'm trying to think of what to do here, because Batman's coming out next week, so I'm like definitely going to talk about that. And I'm going to go see it I usually stream on Wednesdays, but I think I'll probably do either a Thursday stream or a Friday stream to talk about Batman. Maybe I'll talk or I could do two and talk about Peacemaker. I watched Peacemaker. I was like so pleasantly surprised by that, actually. Fantastic. It's a fantastic show. But yeah. Okay. So for everyone watching, plan next week for a later stream in the week, probably Thursday or Friday. You can find that info on my social channels. And also, if you want to keep up to date and just hang out and chat, you can join the Main Gang Discord. I'll put that information in the chat. You can also find it on my Instagram right now. And you can stay up to date on my streams. So you all have a lovely evening, and I'll see you around. Bye.